Hi all, and welcome to the 6th tutorial of this course, where we'll be chatting ethics in psychological research. Of course, tutorial number 5 was the presentations that you gave last week. This will be a shorter tutorial and there will be a weekly assignment for this week. So please pay close attention as this material is vital for the successful structuring and writing of the 6th assignment, which I will introduce a bit later in the tutorial. Before we get down to ethics, I wanted to give some feedback on your last written assignment. Of course, this is general, so please weigh anything I wrote in your personal assignment comments on Canvas greater. Overall, well done. I saw some strong operationalization of variables and some good rationale for your proposed methods of manipulation and/or measurement of said variables. With that being said, I want to stress that some students are still not providing rationale from previous research when you're asked to, which was in sections 2 and 3 of assignment 4. So section 2 was how will you manipulate or measure your independent variable, and section 3 was how will you measure your dependent variable if you forget. So while I may not have taken marks off this assignment if you didn't do that, you will receive very low marks if you continue to leave this out in your proposal that you're handing in next week. So how do you know if you're providing rationale informed by previous research or not? Maybe some people are misunderstanding instructions and just don't know. So if the paragraph or 2 that you wrote doesn't contain any citations at all, that means you're not providing that rationale from previous research. It's not enough to say something like, I'll be creating a self-report scale to measure X construct, which will have 10 questions that will range from 1 to 5 in Likert scale format. If you're doing that, you need to include that info, of course, so don't cut that out. But on top of that, you also need to provide rationale for why you consider a self-report scale to be the best way to measure the construct in the first place. Why you actually need to make your own measure. So are there absolutely no measures of this construct already created? And generally, you should say a bit about how other researchers have measured that same construct in the past, which will very likely inform how you're measuring it currently. Their methods should align with yours at least somewhat. Generally, my best advice for you here is to look at the methods of the studies in your literature review that are the absolute closest in topic and design to your study, and often you'll be citing them again in your methods, so not just in your literature review. A couple of other points. Think about if you're actually manipulating your independent variable. Some students are still using this language, probably just because it's used at other times in the course, but they're not critically considering what design their proposed study actually employs. So they're just saying that they're manipulating their independent variable when they're actually not. It's a correlational study, they're just measuring it. So think about this more while you're writing your proposal. And finally, keep the design simple. I know you submitted assignment 4 before you presented in tutorial and received feedback from me, so I didn't penalize anyone for their proposed design complexity, but this brings me to the next slide. Some general feedback on your presentations that happened last week. To those who presented, really great work. I know it's stressful to present and often not asked for in second-year courses, but you all handled it quite well and I'm really proud. My strongest words of advice are to keep it simple again and consider revising or shifting your study focus or design with my feedback in mind. This is mainly because many of you proposed wonderfully complex projects that would function really well as actual studies, but will make both of our heads hurt data generation and analysis wise, and will be impossible for you to describe well in just 10 pages. So if I strongly hinted that taking away one independent variable or dependent variable, or taking away one method of measuring your dependent variable would help you, I'd strongly advise for you to consider doing it. Consider too how you will recruit your participants or obtain your data another way, like through archival records, as you must include this information in the methods section of your proposal. Some of you had put a lot of thought into this and it showed in your presentation while others skipped over it. So this note is more intended for that latter group. And finally, please remember that you must include all the content you would use to administer your study if you were actually doing it in your appendices. So this includes any questionnaires that you are using that have already been created, a copy of one you created yourself if you're doing that, and any other stimuli you're using in your study, like for example, a short vignette, or a list of names of songs you'll be showing participants, material you'll be expecting them to read and then memorize, or the test you'll use to assess their memorization of learning material, etc., etc. So one concern I have is that many of you, again, have these fabulous and complex studies, but you'll need a lot of material such as essays or books the participant will need to memorize that you're using as stimuli, your independent variable, or tests you'll use to assess their memorization. So that's the measurement of your dependent variable. So you might be going along and writing your proposal, assuming you can just say, I will measure their memorization of material with a test of 60 questions, and then just say that, leave it at that in your proposal. So you can't, you need to actually create that 60 question test and include it at the end of your proposal. That makes it a lot more complex, right? And a lot more time consuming. So please feel free to reconsider, make things simpler, but be thorough in what you need to hand in on the 28th. And of course, if you have any questions about that, please see me in office hours today or send me an email. Phew, now on to our short tutorial about ethics. So this is another research issue that can sneak up on unsuspecting students quite easily. You might have assumed that because we're not actually conducting our studies on real people, that anything goes ethics-wise. Well, it doesn't. It wouldn't be great of us as TAs to be okay with you asking your hypothetical participants to do something that is considered unethical by most research ethics codes, and therefore suggest that these were proper research methods to you, or at least implicitly kind of suggest that that's okay. So you will need to consider ethics in your research design and make sure your hypothetical study adheres to general ethical guidelines. With that being said, you generally cannot involve people in research without their knowledge or consent, invade the privacy of the research participant, coerce people to participate, lead participants to commit acts that diminish their self-respect. And number 4 makes me think about Milgram's obedience study and why it wouldn't be considered ethical to run the same study in the present day. You can't violate the right to self-determination. So this concerns research on behavioral control and character change. You shouldn't deceive by omission. So this is purposely withholding from the participant the true nature of your research. You shouldn't actively deceive the research participant, expose the research participant to physical or mental stress, withhold benefits from participants in control groups. So this is why in many randomized control trials, it's a necessary evil to have the control group on a wait list of sorts, but promise that if the new treatment is discovered to be effective at the end of the study, that those control participants will receive it immediately after. And this is also why arguably a more preferred RCT design is the treatment as usual design, as that means that the control group is still receiving some sort of treatment, but still serving as a control. You also shouldn't fail to treat research participants fairly and with consideration and respect, and you shouldn't misuse or misconstrue research results. However, we sometimes are allowed to deceive participants when participant knowledge of the study purpose and if relevant, the independent variable manipulation would jeopardize obtaining true data, and if the risks of deception are minimal and acceptable. Researchers may also introduce some very small degree of harm. So for example, participant stress, mild shocks, negative emotional states, or discomfort if it is deemed acceptable and participants are consenting. This last part is arguably one of the most important parts of the research ethics process. So that's what we're going to talk about now. Since we require consent from our participants, it is crucial that they are informed of and are fully aware of what they are consenting to when they say that they'll participate in your research. That's why we say informed consent forms, not just consent forms. You will have almost certainly come across at least one of these before. Have you completed research participation as part of PSYC 100, 102, or this class? Since it's a requirement for this class, I hope you have. You will have been presented with an informed consent form that you will have needed to either physically or digitally sign prior to participating in the research. As a spoiler for this week's assignment, you'll be making your own for your research project. But before that, I'll go through each of the key components that you'll be expected to include in your weekly assignment of your informed consent form. As an overview, informed consent forms include the general purpose and procedures of the research. This is not the hypothesis. I'll talk about that a bit more later. Anticipated risks, discomforts, adverse effects, and costs, anticipated benefits, alternative procedures or treatments, if any, confidentiality and limits to confidentiality, incentives and compensation, contact information and access to further info about the research, and voluntary participation and freedom to discontinue participation. Let's now go through the key sections of an informed consent form that you'll be expected to include in your own. All of these sections shouldn't be longer than 2 to 4 sentences, so this is an opportunity to be really clear and succinct. Start with the invitation and study purpose, which outlines the general purpose of your study very briefly and in plain language. This is not a restatement of your research question or hypothesis. This is much simpler than that. Possible headers that you could use for this section include, why should you take part in this study, or why are we doing this study? So here's an example. You are asked to participate in an online psychology survey being conducted by Madison Almond from the Department of Psychology at Simon Fraser University. The project is being conducted as part of a PSYC 201W research methods project. This study examines your ability to read others as well as aspects of your personality. So you see how I outlined the general purpose of the study in just one sentence. Try and do something like that and only mention the 2 or 3 key constructs you're interested in. Don't go into any more detail than that. Next, you'll need to write about voluntary participation. This section will stress the voluntary nature of the participants' involvement in the study. They don't have to participate if they don't want to. In no one study should participants need to do something. That's pretty unethical. A sample heading could be your participation is voluntary, and unless you need to mention something else, you can write just one sentence, something like participation in this research study is entirely voluntary. So this is quite simple. Next, we have withdrawal. This section will indicate that participants may withdraw at any time without giving any reasons, or that they don't need to give reasons to validate their withdrawal. Please also indicate when and how participants can withdraw their data from a study. Of course, we as researchers don't want this because that would mean we have less data to analyze, but it's generally better to give participants a chance to do this if you can. So for example, they could participate, then email you, the researcher, and ask that their data could be withdrawn, and then you could go into your data file and just delete their line of data. If this is not possible, this must be explained in the consent form. An example of why this wouldn't be possible is if the data was entirely anonymous. If that's the case, therefore, we wouldn't be able to tell which data was the participants who wanted it withdrawn. So if you anticipate your data to be completely anonymous, i.e. no identifying information is collected, so no demographics at all, no birth date, no participant address, anything that's very identifying. You need to state that participants can withdraw at any time during their actual participation, but once they've given their data, they will not be able to withdraw it from analyses. Having completely anonymous data is fine, and in most situations, it's actually preferred so that even if the data got out, there wouldn't be anything identifying about it, so no one would know it's the participants. So it is fine if you have to write this, that participants aren't able to withdraw their data once they give it, but you just need to give participants a heads up either way. I hope that makes sense. A sample heading for this could be, what if I decide to withdraw my consent to participate? And an example of this section is something like, you are free to withdraw at any time without any negative consequences. A refusal to participate or withdrawal after agreeing to participate will have no adverse effects on the grade or evaluation in the course or classroom. Since data are completely anonymous, you will not be able to withdraw any data you have already provided. You will then write about your study procedures. This is quite different than your proposal methods section. In the methods section, you will go very in-depth. Instead, this section explains in very simple terms and lay terms what will happen to people or what they have to do if they participate in your study. Also, be sure to include the total amount of time you expect it would take to participate, and a rough estimate is fine for this. Focus on tangible actions they will have to do, and don't include anything like the actual names of the questionnaires you're giving them, because they don't need to know that. Sample headings for this section include what happens if you say, yes, I want to be in the study, or what happens to you in the study, or how is this study done? Here's an example. Note how brief and simple it is. You will be asked to respond to a series of questions concerning your personality traits and how you perceive other people's thoughts. This survey will take approximately 15 minutes to complete. Next, confidentiality. This section will typically assure participants that their identity will be kept confidential. If you are planning on disclosing their identity, you must say this. Participants have a right to know who will be seeing what could often be personal information of theirs. But generally, the vast majority of research does not need to disclose participant identity, and if there is no good reason for you to do so, you definitely shouldn't. And in fact, you shouldn't really be collecting things that are very integral to their identity in the first place. Like you usually don't collect research, participants' names for research purposes unless you're looking at files. However, if you're proposing research in which a participant could reasonably disclose that they are planning serious and imminent harm to themselves or someone else, researchers are under a burden to report this to authorities. So this is all a little beyond the scope of 201, so I won't expect this, but you'll definitely impress me if you do include this. So see the longer informed consent form that I'm sending out via email this morning for wording around how to do this, because we're not going to cover it in this tutorial. Sample headings here include, how will your identity be protected? How will your privacy be maintained? Measures to maintain confidentiality. And an example is, all of the information that you provide in this study will be anonymous and confidential. Short and sweet. Now, the risks and benefits to participants section. It is not included in the informed consent form template I sent around this morning, but I do want you to include this, as it is typically required for informed consent forms in real-life research. In this section, you'll detail any risks or benefits to participants that they may encounter if they choose to participate. What are these risks and benefits? Commonly, risks in psychological studies include certain questions on questionnaires, such as, have you attempted suicide before? or similar things to that. And that may cause the participant reading them to experience sadness or other negative emotions. Some might view this as quite minor, but you should note it in your form. You don't need to write exactly what the question or questions are, but you do need to write what kind of emotions the participant is at risk to experience. Less common risks include physical harm the participant might be caused, or the chance of their data being identified if it was actually lost or accidentally lost or posted online, etc. Think of the worst case scenario that could happen, but then you can write right after it that that situation is unlikely. Benefits often take the form of compensation of some sort, so money paid for completing the study or gift cards given, etc. Often researchers who are tight on budget will load a couple gift cards to places like Amazon or grocery stores and enter participants in a draw to win one of 3. So you're not having to provide every single participant with money. You just have to have a couple gift cards of $100 or so. Now, don't just say in your study, even though it's hypothetical, that you'll be giving all your participants $100 or something. You do need to be realistic here, but you are welcome to write that you will compensate them in some believable way, especially if other researchers have done it in the past in your area. You could also write that there might not be a tangible benefit to participants themselves, but that society will benefit from the implications of your study once you look at your results. Sample headings here include, will I benefit from participating in this study? What are the risks of participating in this study? Here's a really simple, short and sweet example. Feel free to use something like this. There are no benefits or risks associated with participating in this study. You will not receive any compensation for participating in this study. Now you should end with a summary participant consent and signature section. This will be the closing paragraph that reassures the participant that their participation is voluntary, gives researcher contact information, and allows the participant to sign and date the form. Here's an example. Taking part in this study is entirely up to you. You have the right to refuse to participate in this study. If you have any concerns, questions, or comments about your participation in this study, you may contact myself with my email address or Dr. Sean Tan with his email address. Your signature below indicates that you have received a copy of this consent form for your own records. Your signature indicates that your consent to participate in this study. You do not waive any of your legal rights by participating in this study. So it'll be expected that you include your full name and email as primary researcher in this last section on your own consent form, and that you end with a prompt for the participant to sign and make a line at the bottom of your document for their signature and space for the date. Alternatively, if you anticipate that you would conduct your study mostly online, you can create a fake button that says "I consent" that the participant could click to give their digital signature. Okay, phew, that was a lot, I know. Please watch this part of the tutorial a couple times if you're confused, and of course, drop by my office hour. Additionally, when I sent around the video link this morning, you should have received a couple documents attached to it. One is the simple 2-page Word document template of the last 7 slides I just covered, which has most of the same information. And another is the official SFU Office of Research Ethics consent form guideline and template. Please use the official SFU one as an additional reference, but it goes a little too in-depth for this course. So as long as you have the 7 headings I just covered, you're fine. I also sent around a more complex sample consent form that I will be using that I created for my master's thesis research. You'll see that I have all the same sections as you. I just go into a lot more detail, but I thought it would be interesting for you to have an example of another real consent form. Anyways, you will have lots of examples and supporting material to work from while making your own this week. I wanted to quickly address something that might come up. If you're collecting data from an archival or third-party source and just accessing records, you probably wouldn't need an informed consent form in real life. You would still submit an ethics application, of course, and they would likely scrutinize your confidentiality procedures even more, since the participants may not know they participated. So it would be absolutely disastrous if their data was leaked. However, for the sake of this assignment, write a consent form as if you were recruiting your same sample of participants for your same study. So you can even say that they won't need to actually do anything in the study procedure section, but just ask them to sign off on you using their data in your research. Of course, you still need to include all 7 sections and write the appropriate information in each of them. Again, feel free to email me if you have any questions about that. Let's now talk debriefing. I don't believe you will need to actually create a debriefing form, and you will certainly will not need to for this week's assignment, but most studies do provide participants with one right after they finish participating in the study. It's similar to a consent form, but usually a bit shorter, and the participant doesn't need to sign it. They just read it and often take a copy with them. There are a couple reasons why we provide debriefing forms. One is dehoaxing. You likely concealed this in your consent form, but in a debriefing form, you would briefly explain what the topic and hypothesis of the study was, as well as what the independent variable or independent variables and conditions of them were, and what the dependent variables were. You also provide a debriefing form for desensitizing purposes. The debriefing also offers the opportunity to reverse any negative thoughts or emotions experienced by the participants during their participation in the study. If any elements of the study had potential to induce negative thoughts or emotions, like asking about self-harm or suicide, you should provide a statement referring participants to SFU Health and Counseling or a similar organization if they're not university students, and give that organization's phone number. You may also consider adding an emotionally positive activity to this stage of the study, such as having participants brainstorm about happy memories and writing down positive keywords, etc. Again, not absolutely necessary, and I would likely not do this if your study is already long or mentally taxing, but if you did include something like this in your study procedure, I would be very impressed. Of course, once again, as it stands right now, you don't need to create a debriefing form, though. Your debriefing form would also include statements concerning access to the data, such as giving the participants opportunity to request their own data or to request the research findings when they become available, so published in a paper or something like that. You'd give your contact information again while doing this, so participants could note down your email for the purpose of contacting you. And finally, you would thank participants for their valuable contribution to research. So a note on ethics in correlational studies. If you're doing a non-experimental study or a correlational study, you might think that you're off the ethics hook just because you're gathering data from things participants are already doing in their lives and not actually subjecting them to anything. However, you're not. Ethics still applies to your study and how you collect your data. It especially applies to how you will keep your data confidential. So pay careful attention to this when you are specifying where you are going to get your data if you are planning to do a non-experimental study. So for example, if you plan to collect a bunch of medical records, there are definitely going to be ethical concerns there, like I already touched on. So consider them and be sure to discuss this in your informed consent. And we're done. As I said before, this week's assignment is the preparation of an informed consent form for the participants of your own research study. The page limit is 2 pages. Do not go over this. In this case, there is no need for APA formatting or references, as most informed consent forms can use any clear font like Arial, Calibri, etc. They can be single spaced and they will not reference any past research. So please don't include the typical things for this, like the reference page and perfect APA formatting. I recommend that you use the template I circulated this morning called Week 6 Assignment Informed Consent template. It has all the necessary header prompts as long as you add in the risks and benefits too. You are also free to use the exact language that it uses in places, especially in parts like the participant consent and signature page, so I won't consider that plagiarism. But please still put effort into this and include all your unique study information. It won't get full marks if you don't. This is due on June 30th at 8:30 a.m. PST. We have no tutorial or lab assignment that week, so next week. So you can rest after handing in your proposal, which I'm sure you'll need, but please still hand this in right on time, and I will be strict with this deadline this week, and I will not mark it if it is late. And we're already at the end. I told you it'd be quite short. As always, I'm available on Zoom from 10 to 11 for my drop-in office hour. Please feel free to come with any questions or concerns you might have about this assignment or the research proposal, which is due this coming Monday at midnight. Have a great rest of your day.